Welcome back, and I just want to say thank you so much for the overwhelming and positive feedback on my first YouTube video, which is part 1 on this topic, and which you should check out if you haven't yet, before or after you watch this. This second part is very important and will introduce some elements which are crucial to not only understand the climate crisis, but to explain it better to others. Again, all of these chapters build on each other, so it's very important to grasp most of them to understand why green capitalism is a myth. Valuing growth seems important intuitively. Who would be against progress? But what is meant by growth is mostly GDP growth. The media and educational institutions have successfully implanted the idea in our mind that GDP growth equates to something universally good. For instance, Joe Biden is still praised for achieving a high rate of GDP growth amidst accelerating inflation, a vast increase in wealth disparity, and COVID deaths. So things don't add up here. When people criticize growth in the sustainability context, they talk about this specific type of growth, not a growth in the standard of living, for instance, which isn't automatically related to GDP, although you are led to believe that it is. But is that true? In the first 3 years of the so-called recovery from the financial crisis, over 90% of the gains in GDP growth went to the richest 1%. So if you've ever felt confused about how any of this matters to your life, it's because it doesn't. But why? Gross domestic product is the most commonly used measure for the size of the economy. It is the total market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. One commonly used method to arrive at GDP is the so-called expenditure approach. According to this approach, GDP is calculated by adding consumption, which is private consumer spending, for instance, buying a car or clothing, plus government expenditures, which includes military expenditures or road construction, plus total investments spent on housing or capital equipment, and net exports, a country's total exports minus total imports. After the Great Depression, the GDP was developed by American economist Simon Kuznets to account for the monetary value of all goods and services produced in an economy. However, even Kuznets himself warned that the GDP doesn't tell us if economic activity is good or destructive. For instance, if you cut down a forest in order to gain timber, GDP increases. If you cut the workday to 6 hours, GDP decreases. More hospital visits due to a pandemic causes a rise in GDP. More appointments with your therapist due to financial stress causes a rise in GDP. When the wealth of billionaires doubles, it usually goes along with a rise in GDP. But what does it matter for the over 90% of people? None of those negatives nor the positives are reflected in the GDP. It only reflects what companies do for you. So taking care of your grandparents, spending time with your family, reading a book under a tree, all of this is of benefit to people, but it isn't reflected in the GDP. But despite the GDP being such a technical side metric, it was nonetheless enshrined by the capitalist states as the end-all be-all at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. It started just as a metric, but it's become a goal. Human well-being is now equal to GDP, when in fact what it measures is the well-being of capitalism. So for instance, when the OECD was founded in 1960, its top goal was and still is to, quote, promote policies designed to achieve the highest sustainable economic growth. This is what current big capitalist governments are aiming for. The US government, the government of the UK, the Russian government. The coalition agreement of the new German government mentions the importance of growth several times. If you're hoping that the Greens in Germany, who are now part of the government, will fight for reducing emissions, well, I have bad news for you. GDP is not merely power in the economic sense, it is political power. Countries with a higher GDP can afford more military investments. A country's bargaining power at the World Trade Organization depends on the size of its GDP. So the strongest economists are able to influence trade deals that serve their own interests and have greater power through sanctions imposed on weaker economies. Within the capitalist economy, everything hinges on growth. If there's no growth, unemployment rises, businesses close, austerity intensifies, homelessness rises, and so on. Now you might say, wait a minute, clearly there must be a correlation between higher GDP and a better life. Growth shows the potential for higher economic activity, and some of it relates to the standard of living. But again, GDP doesn't account for distribution. If 10 people own half of all businesses in an economy, much of GDP growth doesn't mean very much for the over 90% of people, no matter how high that GDP might be. There's a potential rise in the standard of living with a higher GDP, but that is different from realized standard of living. And in any case, global warming due to carbon emissions just shows how futile this claim is. Of what need is a smartphone every year on a planet on fire? According to the consensus in public health research, the two most effective and greatest predictors of raised life expectancy are 1. Water sanitation measures, and 2. Universal health care and child vaccination in particular. In the US, water sanitation alone accounts for 75% of the decline in infant mortality from 1900 and 1936, and 50% of the total decline in mortality rates. The US has the second highest per capita GDP in the world, yet gives less access to healthcare than most countries on Earth. So you have many places in the world, predominantly the exploited low-income nations, without water sanitation and without good healthcare provision, while still having global GDP growth due to other sectors growing, such as weapon manufacturing. Not all GDP growth is bad for the environment. It's just about rejecting GDP growth as inherently positive and worthwhile. In times where we need to scale back emissions, is it more urgent to build another airport in Germany instead of 10 hospitals in Kenya, which fulfill a more basic need? Investing more in public schools and hospitals as opposed to military expenditure, for instance. GDP doesn't differentiate between the two. Among others, historian Simon Stretzer has analyzed the relationship between economic growth and human health, and has found that, quote, "The historical record clearly shows that the process whereby this wealth is created, economic growth itself, has no direct, necessary positive implications for population health. But if all that growth has little to nothing to do with our well-being, why are governments and the mass media so fond of it? Well, because most of it is appropriated by the rich. Real per capita GDP in the US has doubled since the 1970s, yet real wages are lower and the poverty rate is higher than 40 years ago. Meanwhile, the income of the wealthiest 1% have more than tripled. Globally, the richest 5% capture almost half of GDP growth. Hundreds of scientists have called on governments to abandon GDP in favor of human well-being and ecology. However, as mentioned in part 1, these states didn't choose GDP as a core metric because they don't know better. They willingly do this because they know GDP growth is good for business. And even if they do change their metrics, it wouldn't mean very much if the underlying system remains the same. GDP sounds harmless, technical, and is ambiguous, just like, quote, the economy or, quote, the markets. We are told it is something we should worry about, but we never quite understand how it matters for us. It would be too honest if we were told regularly how, when the economy or the stock market does well, it is mainly good for those who already own big business. Capital is thought of as a thing, a factor of production in mainstream economics. But capital only means something within a specific social relation. A piece of technology, for instance, does not exist in a vacuum. There are people who own it. The most effective propaganda by the ruling class is hiding that something is propaganda. Capitalism itself is rarely referenced to directly in dominant economic theory. If you open up an economics textbook, you will likely never even see the word capitalism in it. Its political essence is depoliticized. Quote, economics is seen as an objective, neutral discipline. This is just how individual consumers and producers happen to make rational decisions. This video will not suffice to explain all the various movements of capital, but a few key concepts should suffice for the purpose of this video. And that first concept is the difference between use value and exchange value. Every commodity has this dual nature. A use value is simply the need or purpose something fulfills. For instance, you make a chair so you or someone else can sit on it. Or you cook a meal at home so you can eat it. Exchange value is the value that a chair has in relation to other commodities, for instance to a cheeseburger, or in relation to money. So for a capitalist, the exchange value dominates. The sole reason they produce a chair is to sell it and make money. Not only make money, but make more money than what was invested in the production of that chair. Otherwise, there'd be little reason to conduct this business at all under capitalism. It would be just charity or a hobby. Of course, use value is important for a capitalist because they can only sell something that is of value to people. But exchange value is primary in that capitalists don't make or provide stuff or a service if they can't accumulate. Of course, some of them may claim to do so, but the fact remains that they are by definition capitalists for exactly this reason. If planting some trees or making some products a little more sustainable helps them in doing that, they will do so, but they will never care about anything else if they put the business at risk. So if you're thinking now, wait a second, I get this, but what has all of this to do with climate change? Well, it has everything to do with climate change. Remember what we said at the beginning, that capital implies a social relation. There's no way for our chair-making capitalists to massively scale up production by just their own doing. Yes, they can buy the wood by themselves and even make the chair themselves. But first of all, the timber they bought does not fall from the sky. Somebody or multiple people had to work to cut those trees down and so on. And there need to be people to buy the chair. But also, if the chairmaker truly intends to become rich with this business, they will hire workers. But also, there needs to be a tree which needs to be cut down somewhere. So where does all that additional money ultimately come from that our chair capitalist makes? How does the math work out in the end? Is it magic? No, of course. It needs to come from labor and the part of nature involved in it. Now, your business school professor might tell you it predominantly comes from the genius of the chair capitalist, or the risk they take. But no matter how great a genius they may be, without the labor of others, they can generate no additional value. The increase in value obtained with the movement of capital, the difference between money spent on labor power and more money, is what Marx calls surplus value. If you study business or economics, this concept does not exist. It is important to mention that surplus value does not exactly equal to profit, but for the sake of simplicity and the focus of this video, I might use the two interchangeably. Under feudalism, surplus value was much more visible. You work on your field for 20 days in a month, and for the next 10 days you work to produce for your landlord. But if you go to work at Starbucks, there's no bell that rings when you're done working for yourself and when you start working for your boss, so to speak. You just sign a labor contract, and because you seemingly choose to do so out of your own free will, you could think that the wage you're getting is what you deserve or what you're worth. But it is not your labor that is being valued, it is your labor power, which itself is bought and sold like any other commodity under capitalism. Another crucial difference to feudalism is that those who appropriate the surplus value, the landed gentry for instance, usually don't reinvest that on a systemic basis. They just live off the labor of poor peasants and enjoy their lives not working. This has partly to do with the main resource being land and agriculture. But under capitalism, the appropriators reinvest in machinery or new technology to increase productivity, and most importantly, their wealth. There is a progressive element in capitalism here. The owners in our society at least do something with all that surplus value, even if what they do is very often not very useful and very destructive. So before I said that the capitalist is mainly interested in growing their wealth, but this is only partly true. Of course they want to do that, but another reason they reinvest is because they have to. For capital, it's grow or die. A fundamental principle of capitalism is competition, which requires businesses to constantly stay ahead of competitors to survive. A stagnating business is a failing business. You can see this in how Amazon constantly acquires other businesses, or how they want to become the everything store in every country. This is also why investors need that growth in order to have a constant or increasing return on investment. Because the more people work and the more trees are getting cut down, the more surplus value there is to be appropriated and the more money there is to be made. Every forest not cut down, every water source not privatized, every hour of workers not spent working, every piece of clothing not sold, every smartphone not sold every year is money lost for the capitalist. Thus, it's imperative that capital increasingly dominates every sphere of life and nature. And remember that growth is exponential. For instance, a 3% growth rate means doubling the size of the economy every 23 years, and then doubling it again from that point on. Investors do in fact use GDP to make investment decisions. A quote bad economy tends to go along with lower earnings and lower stock prices. Let's say you're an investor interested in giving the chair capitalist some money. Your goal is 10% returns. If the chair capitalist shows any signs of slowing down, you might push them to decrease the wages of their workers to increase the profit rate. But if stuff like that is impossible, you invest that money somewhere else, maybe in an arms producer. You don't care what those chairs or weapons are used for, you just want your 10% return. Money not invested in anything is a net loss over time. Machines depreciate and so on. In order for capital to have value, it must be in movement. It must grow. But okay, you might think, can we not just have a non-growth capitalism? Well, no, because first of all, it wouldn't be capitalism anymore. No growth capitalism is an oxymoron. Why would capitalists, who with every fiber of their beings believe that they own the means of production and the profits they produce, choose to operate under a non-growth philosophy and intentionally risk to lose their class position? That's not how human history has ever worked. A steady-state capitalist economy is only conceivable in theory, if separated from the reality of economic, political, and social relations of capitalism itself. But most importantly, no growth under capitalism means crisis. And of course, we all know who suffers the most from economic crises, and it is certainly not the owner class. But it's not just the growth imperative which makes green capitalism impossible, although that may be the biggest reason. It's the whole way it operates. There is both a systemic imperative to use the cheapest materials and the most profitable supply structure. For instance, in the state of Texas, where deregulation of the energy sector led to price increases and did nothing to increase the quality of the infrastructure, it was one of the main reasons why the 2021 power crisis turned out to be so devastating. It is only the immediate self-interest the individual capitalists pursue, regardless of the regulations placed on them, such as when Lufthansa operated 18,000 empty or near-empty flights that would otherwise have been cancelled due to lack of passengers, including 3,000 flights under its subsidiary Brussels Airlines. Friedrich Engels explained this in 1880, quote, "As individual capitalists are engaged in production and exchange for the sake of the immediate profit, only the nearest, most immediate results must first be taken into account. As long as the individual manufacturer or merchant sells a manufactured or purchased commodity with the usual coveted profit, he is satisfied and does not concern himself with what afterwards becomes of the commodity and its purchasers. The same thing applies to the natural effects of the same actions. What cared the Spanish planters in Cuba who burned down forests on the slopes of the mountains and obtained from the ashes sufficient fertilizer for one generation of very highly profitable coffee trees? In relation to nature as to society, the present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the immediate, the most tangible result. The only solution to the climate breakdown is to plan production as a society around use value, not exchange value. We need to produce for human needs first and foremost, and according to planetary limits, not for capital accumulation. But how come people claim capitalism can stay within those limits? Degrowth has become a popular concept, but it is misunderstood by quite a few people. Degrowth is not about reducing GDP. It is about reducing resource and energy use, while at the same time improving social outcomes. But because environmental pressure goes along with GDP growth, GDP has to take the second seat. Life and nature come first, not GDP. A lot of people will say that unlimited growth is what we want. It's just in our nature and we can't help but want it. But even if that were to be true, we cannot have growth just because we want it. The planet doesn't really care what we want. This is not a negotiation. We must stop demanding nature to give us whatever we want. We must ask the planet, what can you give us so we are allowed to stay here? Not all degrowth proponents are also anti-capitalists. Many claim that capitalism can be reformed in order to move to an ecological degrowth type of capitalism, which is a bizarre attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. It is an incorrect position which just goes against all the evidence. It is certainly not to be confused with eco-fascism, which does contain that Malthusian position of combating population growth. Degrowth is not about reducing the quality of life, and it is certainly not about reducing populations. Now let's talk about green growth. Green growth basically means reconciling GDP growth with sustainability. It usually means the attempt to further grow the economy through green technology, such as renewables technology. Every form of energy production needs material. Extracting material from the planet is not for free. It always comes with consequences. Cutting down forests, soil depletion, emptying oceans, offshore drilling, more fracking, which in turn leads to more waste, or plastics in the ocean. Increase in material use tracks quite closely with GDP growth, with no signs of slowing down, even outpacing it since the year 2000. Not at all a tendency you would like to see in a sustainable economy. Scientists estimate that 50 billion tons per year is what the planet can endure. Today, we are exceeding this limit twice. And virtually all of this overshoot comes from imperialist nations. There's the same thing happening with emissions. Of course, fossil fuels produce carbon emissions, but what causes the use of fossil fuels? So states have been increasingly moving away from coal to, say, natural gas, a less polluting fuel. Does that mean that CO2 emissions have went down? They have in a few imperialist countries, but they haven't on a global scale. Why? Because if you move away from coal but you keep growing GDP at the same time, it's not an energy transition, just an energy addition. Same goes for renewables. There has been a vast increase in demand and supply for renewables, but because capital must expand, they are just added on top of current emission-producing activity. In general, the higher the total economic activity, the more difficult it is to transition towards sustainability. There are no signs whatsoever that a fast enough reduction of emissions can be achieved by simultaneously introducing renewable technology and growing the economy. And this is backed by several studies. Scaling back the economy and organizing it around human need is not difficult to do if there was the political will to do it. It's not magic, as opposed to believing in the myth of green capitalist growth. Green growth is based on an assumption, the green technology assumption. But is that assumption actually true? That question will be answered in part 3. And part 3 is likely the most important one, because we'll look at the actual evidence and debunk some of the most common arguments you hear over and over again in favor of capitalism's ability to become sustainable, such as how the UK or France have been able to slightly reduce emissions while increasing GDP growth. And we're gonna look into why that is a misleading claim. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in part 3.